بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم الحمد لله حق حمده وصلى الله وسلم وبارك على خاتم أنبيائه ورسله سيدنا ونبينا محمد وعلى آله وصحبه وحزبه. Alhamdulillah, in our lessons on the essentials of worship, we looked at the chapter on the supererogatory prayers, the nawafil. And we close by looking at these various recommended sunnah prayers that we can bring into our life. And these are things that we should not neglect. We're going to be looking bi'idhnillahi ta'ala at some of the ahkam, the rulings related to nafil prayers. So he says, rahimahullah ta'ala, that وَيَتَنَفَّلُ قَاعِدًا مَعَ الْقُدْرَةِ عَلَى الْقِيَامِ. One can make the nafil prayer sitting, even when one has the ability to pray standing. One can pray the nafil sitting, meaning sitting on the ground with prostration. And this is one of the common errors, and this is why translation is also delicate. That when they say qa'idan, qu'ud is, for example, what you're doing. Right? Qu'ud is sitting on the ground. It's important, even if we teach people in the masjid, whatever, because people have that, okay, if you can't pray standing, what do? You pray sitting. So what do we associate with sitting? Is we sitting on a chair. That's a problem. Because this is not considered sitting. This is considered praying with head movements. So sitting is sitting on the ground such that one prostrates. Right? So nafil prayer is valid sitting on the ground even if you could stand. However, if one does so without excuse, it has half the reward of praying standing. Unless one had an excuse. Unless one had an excuse. So the fard prayer, you cannot omit standing unless you're unable or unless there's genuine hardship, as we know. But outside the fard and the wajib, you can do sunnah prayers and recommended prayers sitting on the ground as well, but with prostration, if you're able to. When there's no excuse, it has half the reward. But if there's an excuse, it's not disliked. So at one level, in terms of facilitation, let's say, you go and you're about to go to sleep and you say, okay, let me pray 2 rakahs before going to sleep. Like, I'm tired. Sometimes it's good to know that they say with one's nafs, there's diplomacy that's good, right? Then let's say you don't normally do 2 rakahs before going to sleep. So you got a good thought that let me do 2 rakahs. The nafs says, no way I'm getting up from bed. It's okay, let's do it sitting down. So you do it, but sometimes you should know what you concede on. Rather than say, okay, I'll do extra tomorrow. Right? That's one of the tricks of the shaitan. And just about the tricks of the shaitan, on Friday for our class on the path, what's it called? The path of piety, the Tariq al-Muhammadiyya class. It's on the YouTube channel. What's the title of it? The Path of Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam. There's a really important lesson on the 7 tricks of the shaitan. Right? The shaitan, and it's a beautiful summary that the shaitan tries to make us not do something. If we can't convince us not to do it, he convinces us to delay it or to do it lazily. If he can't convince us to do it lazily, he'll convince us to do it hastily. And all the various tricks, if he can convince us to do it, not to do it, nor to delay it, nor to do it lazily, nor to do it hastily, then he'll say, well, at least show off. Right? Like, let people know. If he convinces you not to show off, then he'll convince you to, you will at least get conceited. right? That you don't show off to us. Say, no, let's be sincere. But they say, okay, well, I'm so good. Like I'm sincere, right? And that conceit, ujb, is probably, it can even be worse than showing off, and so on. So it's a really important lesson, and how one combats each of these tricks. And it's good to know that part of the diplomacy with the self, sometimes one negotiates down, and sometimes one can be firm, and one needs to know what one can do. One of the great Imams of Islam, Shaykh al-Islam Zakaria al-Ansari, who started teaching in his early teens, and he taught for 90 years. He died past 100. When he started seeking knowledge, he was so poor that he used to go to the garbage dumps in Cairo and look for watermelon rinds or any leftovers. And that's what he would survive on. And in the end, he had people working for him to distribute his charity, right? But he was so devoted that Imam Ash-Sha'rani relates that even in his final sickness, and he's past 100, he would still do even his nafil prayer standing up. And Imam Ash-Sha'rani, Imam Abdul Wahhab Ash-Sha'rani, would serve him and say he would be so weak that he would be swaying like a tree does in strong wind. So Imam Ash-Sha'rani asked him, Maulana, Allah has not made you responsible to do this. So he said, my son, how do I know that if I give my nafs, my lower self, what it wants now, that it'll prevent me from what I need with my Lord? And that's resolve, right? But Allah loves both the dispensations taken right, but also the resolve. But part of diplomacy is to know, sometimes you got to be firm with yourself, sometimes you concede, but to know what you concede not just to give in, but you negotiate. Okay, I want to do these 2 rakahs. Where sometimes you have the energy, so okay, no, I'm going to do it standing. Other times it's good to know, to concede, and that quietens it, right? Because you got a thought of doing good, the basis is do it. But sometimes you got to negotiate. Bismillah. It's also valid to do nafil prayer riding outside city limits with head movements, in whichever direction you are traveling. So once you're outside city limits, you can pray, but this is only for nafil. For the fard, you have to pray on the ground, but nafil. So for example, you're driving to, where do you guys come from? Waterloo. Waterloo is outside the Greater Toronto area, right? So once you're outside the GTA, you can do nafil prayer, whether you're driving or a passenger. You can't do your fard like that. For fard, you have to stop somewhere and pray on the ground. And we'll look at the fiqh of traveling soon, but nafil you can do with head movements. And head movements, whether you're driving or in the car or in general, head movements, you just have to move your head slightly. You don't have to move your whole back for bowing, and slightly deeper for prostration. And here it would be proper, of course, that especially if you're the one riding, to keep your eyes on the road. So you don't lower it'd be impermissible. Even the road straight, it'll probably not be permissible to look down. Okay? You look. So this applies to all nafil prayers, including sunnah, right? Including sunnah. If you're outside city limits. We'll look at the issue of what are considered city limits in large urban areas. But the summary of it is that we would consider the urban area, right? So once you've left the Greater Toronto area, right? And we'll look at the fiqh of travel related to that when we get to it. Bismillah. But the fard and the wajib cannot be performed on an animal or in a car, for example, unless there is genuine excuse, right? Which would be fear for oneself or one's belongings, right? Right? Or if there's torrential rain and there's nowhere to stop, for example, right? And that's one of the, that can be, but we'll look at the fiqh of travel a little more later. Now, from the sunnah prayers, the next section is on the Taraweeh prayer. Taraweeh is an emphasized sunnah in Ramadan. The 20 rak'ahs are an emphasized sunnah, both for men and women, after performing the Isha prayer. So if someone gets late to the masjid and they didn't pray Isha, you have to do Isha first and then join the Taraweeh, right? It can be performed anytime till Fajr, whether before the Qunut or after. The congregation for Taraweeh is a recommended sunnah. But in each locality, it's an emphasized sunnah to do Taraweeh. So even in the Greater Toronto area, for example, a number of the masajid stayed open. And they performed Taraweeh, but behind closed doors. Why? Because it's a collective sunnah mu'akkada to do the Taraweeh. So we had in the Misag area, a number of masajid were conducting Taraweeh, but behind closed doors because of the current circumstances. Right? Because these are of the symbols of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, right? The congregational prayer, the masjid, the congregational prayer, etc. And it's a recommended sunnah to do khatm of the Quran in Taraweeh. It's a recommended sunnah. But if it's difficult for people to complete the Quran, right? Then from the earliest centuries they've said that gathering the people is given precedence over completing the Quran. So even in the 6th Islamic century, the author of the Ikhtiyar, Imam al-Mawsili, 6th, 7th century, he died 683, I believe. Yeah, 683. Hijri. He said that the best in our times is to recite an amount that's not heavy for people. So the sunnah itself is to pray 20 rak'ahs. Right? So sunnah mu'akkada. Now we also have to appreciate that as much as we love our madhab, there is mercy in there being difference of opinion in our deen. Right? And that's why Allah and His Messenger have made the rulings as they are. And the Sahaba differed. And the Prophet in his own lifetime acknowledged those differences. Right? So don't impose, what you study and what you follow is for you. Right? But the deen is not what you follow. The deen is what has been deemed within the wide scope of the deen. And that's something very important for us to keep in mind. And also can be a sickness of the self, right? Because implicitly, if you go and say, some sister name, sister, Hiba's friend, sister, Hidayah, goes telling people that, do you pray 20 rak'ahs? No. That's sunnah mu'akkada. Right? Implicitly, one, you're being harsh on people. You're making religion difficult for them. Number 3, there's an implicit sense of either conceit or arrogance that can creep in. I'm better than you. And you don't know people's circumstances. Right? Yassiru wa la tu'assiru. Make things easy. And within this, there's, like the Hanafis, each madhab has an internal coherence and balance. So in our madhab, it's very difficult to make your actions invalid. Okay? How many integrals are there of the prayer? How many integrals? 5. That's it. Right? So you have to almost try hard to make your prayer invalid in the Hanafi madhab. In the Shafi'i school, there's either 17 or 21, and there are different numberings depending how you count the individual things that are obligatory, right? So it's much harder to make something valid. But in some of the other madhabs, what is the consequence of leaving the emphasized sunnah? In our madhab, you make a habit to leave the emphasized sunnah, it can be sinful. But in the Shafi'i school, if someone left the sunnah mu'akkada their whole life, they've missed out on tremendous reward, but would they be considered sinful? No. So you see this internal balance, that one thing is easier in this way, but stricter in another. Right? And that's why in our own practice, just following a madhab as best one can gives us a balanced taqwa, right? Right? But also gives us ease in some places and tests us in others. But you can't impose that on everybody else. And yes, it's good to be aware, not for you to be a slacker. They say, oh, there's an opinion that I don't have to do the 20 rak'ahs. No, that's you don't learn to become a slacker. You learn to try to do better, but you also learn to learn mercy, right? That in other schools, yes, across the 4 schools, the 20 rak'ahs is considered a sunnah mu'akkada, but their understanding of the emphasized sunnah is distinct. It's not sinful to leave even if there's a habit, even if someone makes it a habit. So if someone, especially in our times when if someone's doing their fard, alhamdulillah, right? Someone goes to the masjid, does 2 rak'ahs, 4 rak'ahs. Firstly, have good opinion. Maybe they're finishing it off at home. Maybe they have an elderly parent to take care of. Someone's sick, they're tired. Don't mind other people's business, right? But someone says, I pray 8 rak'ahs. Alhamdulillah. Right? These are not things that commanding the good and forbidding the wrong relates only to what is obligatory or haram and is agreed upon. There is no condemnation in matters of difference. So it's important to be aware of that we try to do what we understand to be better. It's also good to be aware that you don't condemn about sunnahs. Right? You don't condemn about sunnahs. Where appropriate, nasiha may be due. So practically, this is the Taraweeh. So if someone's praying on their own, recite what you're able to, right? Even if you're tired someday, it's better to do 20 brief rak'ahs than to omit it. Bi'idhnillah. Any questions here before we continue? So the next section is on imama, on leading the prayer and congregational prayer. So he tells us that congregational prayer is an emphasized sunnah for men, right? Congregational prayer is an emphasized sunnah for men, right? And the minimum congregation is 2 people, right? And this is unless there's an excuse, right? Unless there is an excuse. And if you look in Nur al-Idah, for example, he lists a whole number of excuses. So, seeking a congregation, right? So what are life situations? If you're at work, for example, you may not be able to make it to the masjid, but if it's facilitated, like there's other Muslims around, etc., then it would be a sunnah to establish a congregation, right? To establish a congregation. Now, at work, if there is something that is pressing that cannot be rearranged, then that would be an excuse for missing the congregation, right? Right? But then for men, it would be recommended to see if one is able to catch a later congregation. It'd be recommended. But one does, in that situation, one does not miss the reward if one had the intention that, had I been able to catch it, I would have. Right? So for example, you know, someone, like you live with somebody and you woke them up and you waited and you tried waking them up again. Right? There, you had the intention that had I been able to, I would have prayed in congregation. You get rewarded for that. But if you don't even try to wake them up, you don't have the reward. That, because human beings are possible to wake up, right? But you don't have to stamp on their head or, you know, crack a few ribs or do anything drastic like that, right? The congregation for women is not a sunnah. Is not a sunnah. And men are actually at a disadvantage here in that the complete reward for a prayer for men is conditional on them praying in congregation or at least striving to pray in congregation. Right? So when they leave it with a genuine excuse, they should have the intention that had I been able to, I would have prayed in congregation. And then one has the full reward because actions are by their intentions. But someone just said, oh well, I'll pray on my own and that's then you're missing out. Now, amongst the things that don't prevent full reward is if someone is traveling. Because we know from the hadith of the Prophet ﷺ that if a person is sick or traveling, all that they used to do when they're healthy and resident is written for them. So when one's traveling, especially in the rush of travel, one has the full reward. But when one reaches one's destination as still a traveler, it would be recommended to try to catch the congregation, right? So and may Allah open the lands with safety, you're visiting, just imagine you go visit Istanbul and you're a traveler. So the congregation for the traveler has less emphasis. But if you're in a Muslim land and there's a masjid around every corner, you know, but the traveler has an excuse because maybe, you know, but certainly in the rush of travel, there's an excuse. But even there, it is recommended. Most airports do have musallas, right? And actually it can be a beautiful experience. One goes, prays in the musalla, one runs into people from different places, etc. It's a beautiful thing, right? That's for men. For women, women have the full reward of their prayer if they pray according to the sunnah, even on their own, right? And the hadiths about that are clear. But if they wish to join the congregation, that's fine, but it's not that they are, but the complete prayer for men, for women, I mean, with the full reward of that, is attained even when they pray on their own. But there's no dislike in them, joining in the congregation. And sometimes it can just be facilitative, right? One's at work, there's a time when everybody prays, so it just sets a routine. I go pray at that time, I meet some other Muslims, and there's, especially in our times, a lot of the ulama said there's wisdoms in that as well, right? That, if you, let's say you have a store right by a masjid, and if you just pray in your store, you're going to just rush through it, but you step away to the masjid and you pray there in the women's section at the time of congregation. It helps you pray more completely. In the rush of the day, you meet other believers, etc. Right? Or at least, there are many wisdoms in that, right? There's many wisdoms in that. Who's most deserving of the imamah, of leading the prayer? They say the first is the most learned. right? The most learned. And this order is recommended. It's a recommended sunnah. So the first is the most learned. And what's meant by most learned is the one who best knows the rulings related to prayer, right? And are upright. Then the one who knows most Quran. But the criteria in knowing most Quran is the one whose recitation is best by the standards of recitation. Then number 3, the most scrupulous person, the one with most wara. Then the oldest, right? Assuming all else is equal, right? So that's the general order. There's a few points related to this. One is practically that if there is an imam, there's an appointed imam, then they're the most deserving person, right? So let's say that some young teenager is the most learned person in their small town outside Waterloo. And there's an imam. So the young guy shouldn't go and say, Imam, can we do a fiqh contest? Whoever wins leads the prayer. No, he's the imam, he leads, right? So don't get bad ideas, inshallah, right? Because if there's an imam, they're given. In some communities, it actually causes problems. So they put a schedule, right? If the imam is not there, then the second, they put an order. Because some places, especially with a diverse community, people of different backgrounds, sometimes this causes tension. It's a good practice. Let's just agree on an order. One of the masajid in GTA has I think it goes down to 13 people. This person, else this, and this is the official policy. Okay? And in the matters that relate to public interest, right? It's not the public that decides who does it, but those responsible for that public interest, right? So for example, if there is so your friend Hidayah starts a non-profit to feed the homeless. Now that's serving the public interest, but she has a board, right? And the decision makers are her and you, right? Now it's in the public interest, but do all of us have a say in how you feed the homeless? No. It's those who are appointed to take care of that. So in a masjid is fulfilling a public interest. But who has the say in the decision making of the masjid? It's those who are in responsibility there, right? The board, the management, according to how that authority and leadership and management is structured. The role of the wider community is nasiha, is advice, right? Right? And that's important because it causes a lot of problems. You go to a masjid and you say, no, so-and-so is more learned. Well, give them advice, but you don't have a right to, they made a decision, you may not know the considerations, right? But of course, deen is nasiha, that if something, like that, let's say they don't know that such and such person who's attending, so there's an elderly man named Sufyan, and he's very learned but very humble, right? So I shouldn't go and say, no, that's actually Shaykh Sufyan, he should be leading. No, you go and advise that Shaykh Sufyan, he's a humble guy but very learned, mashallah, and that's how we approach it. The one who knows most Quran, there's a bad habit that affects us in our choice as well. That good Quranic recitation is a recitation that corresponds with, number one, minimally the rules of tajweed, and good recitation is recitation that has good tajweed in it. Why? Because what is tajweed? Tajweed encapsulates prophetic recitation, or attempts to encapsulate prophetic recitation, right? That we are blessed, that we know through mass transmission, through tawatur, exactly how the Prophet ﷺ recited, and the variances in that recitation. That's an amazing thing. So beautiful recitation, and what's our notion of beauty? Beauty is that which, husn. That's why there's a relationship in Arabic between the hasan, the good, and husn, beauty, are from the same root, right? Beauty is that which gathers the good in a good manner. But what is the good? Al-hasan ma hassanahu Allah. The good is what Allah deems good. And we know the hadith. Allahu jameel yuhibbul jamal. Allah is beautiful and He loves beauty. And this is something that that sometimes, okay, mashallah, so-and-so has a beautiful recitation. Okay, we don't go around correcting people unnecessarily, just throwing our advice, but to get ourselves used to that, what is good? Say, okay, what is the guidance of Allah and His Messenger about this matter? What makes it good? According to the guidance of Allah and His Messenger, right? And sometimes we have to approximate, we do the best we can, right? Because sometimes, let's say there's someone who has really beautiful, who has really precise recitation, but you don't find it inspiring. But don't just go for some really soulful recitation, but is this according to the principles of tajweed? And it's a bad habit. People share recitations of different people, etc. Right? But just say, okay, and the simple thing is, who are reciters, for example, that the ulama say are good reciters. And sometimes they'll give multiple advices because different recitations appeal to different people. Right? And sometimes the most beautiful, the most powerful recitation sometimes it's like good food, right? Like fast food is loaded with fat and salt and sugar and all these things, right? But it takes time sometimes to cultivate appreciation. Likewise with recitation. And you can't really go wrong with, the great masters of the modern era of Quranic recitation. The greatest master of that is Shaykh al-Husari. And there's a number of good recitations of him. It's less melodious, etc. But if you listen carefully, right, there's a real sense of the majesty of the Quran in his recitation. He's a very special person, and one of the great and of course, no one really beats the Egyptians in Quran recitation. One of the senior scholars of Egypt, we had an appointment with him in Jordan, in his hotel room, and unbeknownst to him, I recorded the whole conversation. He said, "What is this brick?" I had a very sophisticated record. So I was recording. He says, "Aiz tafdahni?" You want to embarrass me? I said, "La, Sayyidi," because there's so much benefit. So I said, "Sayyidi, just we talk different things." I said, "What?" He was praising the Egyptian reciters. I said, "What about the Syrian reciters?" He said, "They're Syrian reciters?" I said, "They don't know how to recite Quran." I was like, "Sayyidi." And he said, "Look, the Egyptians understand this, and he practiced." He said, "Look, this is how Husari does it, this is how Manshawi does it, for all 6 points." He said, "Bring me the Syrian. How do they do this?" And he did a Syrian type recitation. He said, "Okay, that tahdifha," delete it. But there are these really powerful recitations, right? And it's good. It's sometimes good to have a range of Quranic recitations, but just because the recitation is beautiful and stuff, and sometimes we'll say, okay, this is a acceptable recitation, it's a good recitation, but there's a higher recitation, right? And there's, alhamdulillah, many great reciters in the ummah, but it's a bad habit. People just, someone opens an Instagram channel and they say, my Quran recordings. Everyone says, "Oh, mashallah," whatever. And that's not the way of that's not how our deen has been preserved as well. Right? That's not how our deen has been preserved. And then the next issue, we're going to just see that there are some things that can be shocking, right? That when they're mentioned without context. So let's read what it says and then see the context, right? It says it's disliked for a slave or a Bedouin or a blind person or a corrupt person or an innovator or a naked person or for women to pray, to lead congregation. So there's a couple of things. One is that the nature of the Arabic language is that the waw as a particle of conjunction, this, comma, this, comma, this, in Arabic, the waw is لمطلق الجمع ولا تفيد المشاركة في الحكم أو في الأوصاف, right? That when things are brought together, it does not mean that there's some interrelationship in the qualities of these things. It just means that the same broader ruling applies to it. It is not saying that there is some interrelationship between these points. And this is a point that Sayyidah Aisha objected to. Sayyidah Aisha frequently, she's a strongly opinionated person, and the ulama wrote about it. Imam Zarkashi actually wrote a treatise where Sayyidah Aisha disagreed. Omar, just give a face mask. Where Sayyidah Aisha disagreed with the other companions. And this is one of the areas. So that is disliked for the slave, the desert Arab, the blind person, the corrupt person, the innovator, the naked, and for women to lead congregation, each for a different consideration. They say the imama of the slave is disliked not intrinsically, but because generally they would be unlearned. They would not have had the opportunity to learn. Right? So they say unless they're learned and God conscious, like the alim and muttaqi. The desert Arabs, because they lived out in the desert, they would usually be unlearned. Right? But they say the quality there is the fact that these people are frequently unlearned. The blind person is not because of their blindness, but rather, again, often blind people would not have the opportunity to learn. But we have an amazing history right from the time of the Sahaba. Of the most learned of the Sahaba were the likes of Abdullah ibn Maktoum, the famous blind Sahabi, and throughout Islamic history, they've been great scholars. One of my main teachers, Shaykh Hassan al-Hindi, is blind. Once in a while he'd joke with people. I didn't be quite serious, that I shouldn't be leading. I'm blind. وَكُرِهَ إِمَامَةِ الْأَعْمَى. Imama. Sometimes he'd do it just to shock some student. Because a lot of times students would just have very superficial knowledge. He says, إيش رأيك في هذا? You should be leading me. And of course the answer is that it's not their being blind that is disliked, or it's not blindness that is disliked, but the fact that if these people are unlearned, or they don't know how to face the qibla, they can't protect themselves from najasa, etc. Right? Right? And it just shows that sometimes in any texts, there'll be things that one doesn't understand. Don't problematize it. Just say, I don't understand this, and ask. Right? And ask. And that's one of the first things we see in the Quran, in Surah Al-Baqarah. The angels asked Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, أَتَجْعَلُ فِيهَا مَنْ يُفْسِدُ فِيهَا? Would you place on earth one who spreads corruption in it? Right? The corrupt person, obviously, right? Because a corrupt person, a fasiq, is not to be trusted in religious matters. And an innovator, right? Someone who's Ahlul Bid'ah. Now, the corrupt person, this of course relates to another thing, which is إِن جَاءَكُمْ فَاسِقٌ بِنَبَإٍ فَتَبَيَّنُوا, right? If a corrupt person comes to you with news, then confirm, right? Then confirm, right? Because why we don't trust, like, you know, you can only, it's a rational thing. You can only trust what someone trustworthy says. Now you can't assume trustworthiness. You need to confirm, right? You know, a believer should not be someone who is, you know, who just gets swayed by any fake news, right? So we take our sources very seriously and religiously, you know, such a person. But if they are the person appointed, it's better to pray behind a corrupt person than pray on one's own, right? And also, of course, the other thing is that if you don't know that they're in a state of ongoing corruption, the default is that you assume that a believer has repented, unless it's obvious to the contrary, right? A congregation of naked people, that seems so, why would there be naked people? Right? A very real thing is, you know, and it's happened in the 20th century. It happened in Syria, happened in Egypt, happened elsewhere, right? Where people were imprisoned and stripped naked, denied water. Now, if you're together, do you pray? No, it's best that people, you know, for prayer, distance themselves so it's closer to haya. So it's makruh for naked people. And there are situations like that. Travelers in the old days, cloth would be very, very precious, especially if you're out in the desert. So the trade routes in Muslim societies were precious, right? Because entire civilizations have collapsed in history by the trade routes getting disrupted. And trade, and that's why one of the gravest punishments in Islam is highway robbery. Because you're not stealing from a person, but by disrupting trade, this is ifsad fil ard. You are ruining the public good for everybody, right? Because it's not only hurting them, but if the trade route is interrupted, other people would then fear going on trade, and it disadvantages everybody. But practically, you know, caravans of trade were like moving wealth. Like that caravan's going, and there's, you know, 30, 40 businessmen traveling together with all their, you know, either what they're taking to sell, or what they've, you know, or money, or they're returning with what they've acquired. So if you're, one of the quickest ways to make money would be, yeah. And of course, this is where the intellect can make you make good choices, but also can just help you make effective choices, right? That intelligence poorly used is not praiseworthy. Say, get rich quick. Who needs to go get investment, this, that? Just get a few thugs together and attack Jacob's caravan. Right? And one of the things that used to happen sometimes, that when they would steal, they'd take everything, including the clothing the traders were wearing. Because especially on a long journey, what you're wearing needs to be resilient and so on. So people are left without anything, right? So in that case, you'd pray separately, right? And congregation of women refers to women praying together. Again, this is one of the issues where there's difference of opinion. In the Hanafi school, a women's only congregation is considered disliked. Why? Because the Hanafis look at, okay, the Sunnah is the general practice of the Prophet ﷺ, and during the time of the Prophet ﷺ, most women prayed at home, Some did come to the masjid, but it's clearly understood that it wasn't the general habit of the prophetic community. And we know how avid the female companions were to follow prophetic teachings. And the general practice was that they prayed alone. And that's the sunnah. We only have individual instances of Sayyidah Aisha or Salama, for example, individual instances of them leading. That's understood to be for the purpose of instruction. Right? But this is, again, it's of the issues where there's difference of opinion. Okay? In the Hanafi school, it's makruh for women to pray in a women's only congregation. In the Maliki school, it's not even valid, because that wasn't the practice during the time of the Prophet or after. But in the Shafi'i school, it's actually recommended for women to pray in congregation. Right? So on these kinds of things, it's important to be soft-headed. To be soft-headed, right? That people are praying in congregation. So let's say, you've learned Hanafi fiqh, and you're with 25 sisters, and they're all praying in congregation. Now, in some situations, people have a maturity of religious understanding and so on. So if you don't join in, they don't mind. But in some contexts, people will mind. Right? So in those kinds of situations, right? Or they ask you to lead, and they would find it strange that you don't do so. There's a lot of leeway, because other madhabs do exist. Right? Other madhabs do exist, and especially being in diverse communities, etc., we should not be sources of fitna. In these things, they say, muwafaqatul jama'a awla min tamassuk bil madhab, right? That acting in a manner that accords with the group is superior to sticking to one's own position, when what they're doing is sound within mainstream Islamic scholarship. It's not like they're going, let people decide, for example, they want to go and eat non-zabiha meat. Right? That's not a relied upon position in any of the four schools, right? So you don't say, everybody else is eating it, so I feel bad. No. In those situations, one stick to what is right, but with discretion, politely. Okay, politely. There's 100 ways to make excuses. Right? Just say, I'm just going to have some. I'm just going to take the vegetarian option. I was inspired by my cousin. She's gone vegan, and enjoy, guys, whatever. You don't need to always speak up, because they're not going to listen anyways. Let's say. But there's a difference between doing what others are doing when it's outside sound Islamic scholarship, or they're doing something questionable or so on. And if they're doing something that's within the four schools, it's sound, right? Then it's a matter of consideration, right? Particularly if it would cause division or fitna or stuff like that. Okay? And the way people are convinced on things, or say, it's better to do it this way, people are convinced more by good conduct and lots of argument, right? Now, in congregation, then he tells us, one of the rules is that if one person is praying next to the imam, they stand to the imam's right, level with the imam, right? With the imam just behind the imam, just with the heel. And then sometimes people stand close to the imam but well behind. No, you stand level with the imam, but just behind with the heel, right? Or more if the person, there's some jittery prayers, right? When they get up, they take a step forward and a step back, and they're looking like they're trying to draw a map of the world with where they're standing. Then take go a little further back, just because they're, But and if there's two or more people, they should be standing behind the imam. It's makruh for them to stand to the imam's right and left, unless the space is tight, for example. Then it's permitted. and of course, if there's one woman, she would be standing behind the imam, right? It's not valid for a man to pray behind a woman. Why? Because that's khilaf ma ja'a bihi Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam. That's contrary to what the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam has come with, right? And one of the things is sometimes we try to explain things in ways that make sense to us, but doesn't make sense to others, right? The simple situation in that is just say, these are the teachings of our Prophet, right? Like what are you going to do? This is what our Prophet said. Like, how are you going to argue with that, right? If you're going to argue with that, you're attacking Islam. Because what is Islam? What the Prophet Muhammad, peace and blessings be upon him, came with, right? It's good to couch it in that. That ends the argument. Said, as Muslim, we understand Islam, that Islam is divine guidance that has been revealed to and conveyed by the Prophet Muhammad, peace and blessings be upon him. Number one. Number two, how we structure our congregational prayer was taught by the Prophet Muhammad, peace and blessings be upon him. And that's what we follow. Don't try to say, well, for a man to be standing behind a woman and she goes into bowing, and people don't understand. People have misconstrued conceptions of what is modesty, what is dignity. If they understood that, they wouldn't dress the way they dress, or they wouldn't accept what they accept of social values. So that doesn't make sense to them. And Sayyidina Ali said, address people according to their understanding. حدث الناس على قدر عقولهم. أتحبون أن يكذب الله ورسوله? Do you wish that Allah and His Messenger be denied? A simple thing is, one of my mentors here in Toronto, he said, look, when in doubt, stand behind your Prophet. Simple. Right? And in reality, when people object, even practicing Muslim or concerned Muslims who have these ideas, the best thing is say, look, as Muslims we follow, there is guidance from the Prophet, we follow it. Bismillah. A child cannot lead a congregation of adults in the Hanafi school. This too has some difference of opinion within the four schools, right? And in the Hanafi school, this applies also to Taraweeh prayer. However, again, it's a matter of respecting difference. In some schools, a mature child can lead in congregation. And a mature child is someone who, if they, you're reasonably sure from beginning to the end of prayer, they would pray correctly, right? They wouldn't just third rakah, they say, I'm tired, guys, I'm running off, or whatever, right? Like, they'll finish the prayer, they'll know what to do, right? They won't just run off, right? Tricked ya, and they run away, right? So there's difference of opinion on that, right? So given that there's difference of opinion on that, again, you have to be soft-headed. And in Taraweeh, even there's a minority opinion in the Hanafi school about it being valid to have a discerning child lead Taraweeh. It's not the relied upon position, but again, we don't. So one Ramadan, Imam Hamid Slimi said, and I was just talking about something, I said, you almost got me in trouble for Taraweeh. I said, well, what? He said about a young Qari. They had a young Qari at the Sayyidah Khadija Center, and we talked about it before, because I'd asked him about options for Qari, because that year we had a South African Qari who was supposed to come and it didn't work out. And he told me they got this young Qari, and he was talking about how beautiful. I'm not going to object because there's different opinion on it. And he had good reasons. Said, we try to encourage the youth and so on. There's reasons why he. So one day, as Taraweeh was about to start, some angry person said, Imam, this is not allowed. This is invalid in the Hanafi madhab, and most of us are Hanafi. He said, how do you know what it says in Hanafi? He said, because I have an answer from Shaykh Faraz. He gives khutbah. He said, do you have it on your phone? He said, let me see. So you almost got me in trouble. I said, Sayyidi, but that's not what the answer says. Because I mentioned in the answer that because you have to answer according to what you're asked. They're asking because they're looking for Hanafi answer. But however, given that there's difference of opinion within the Hanafi school about this and with other madhabs, you should not condemn someone or cause this source of division, etc. So that's a very important aspect, right? So I thank you for that, however. So, alhamdulillah. So that's not, yes?
In terms of reading the prayer, if amongst a group of people, logically speaking, you're the most learned, or you're the most learned in terms of the religion. Is it considered bad character or bad adab when you go tell the people that I know the most about the Quran, and therefore I should lead the prayer?
No, it requires, those things require discretion, right? It requires discretion, right? So in some situations, especially if there's people who do it correctly, let's say because you're with a group, that's where, for example, in a group, they know somebody, they trust somebody, you let them lead. But we've had situations, for example, in family, when we, I'm sort of the designated family Maulvi now, but initially, like we had a situation where someone made a mistake and said, oh, sorry, I'm going to start again. Like in the first rak'ah of prayer, right? They made a mistake and they said, okay, oops, let's start again. And so it requires wisdom, right? Because you don't want to be disrespectful to anybody. You don't want to cause ill intent. You also have to guard your own heart. Right? That idea, of being arrogant or conceited. So you have to play it by ear. And sometimes one learns some of these things. I have a friend of mine. We went together to Beirut because he's publishing some books. And we used to visit different printers. Many of the publishing houses, their offices were outside the heart of Beirut, because during the Civil War, they continued publishing books out of Beirut while the Civil War was happening. So they were in like these funny locations, often, like it's hard to believe in a Muslim majority place that we are within the city, but there's no masjid around. It's a very strange thing. Because the areas where there's masjids, there'll be more attacks. So they moved their offices to these areas. It was quite strange. So several times it happened, and we were going, because we were broke. So we're holding these meetings around lunchtime. We didn't have enough money to pay for the whole trip. Said, look, we might be publishing with them. If we go around lunchtime, they'll probably feed us. Because we're totally broke. Like we survived for 2 weeks on less than $100. And then we blew the rest of the budget on one meal. Still don't understand. In the year 2000, that one meal cost over $100. And it was just shawarma and kibbeh. I don't know how it could have cost that. Even in Canada, 2 people eating, a good shawarma meal costing, I forget how much it was. It was a lot of money, $80 to $100. I forget, there's a big number. And that was actually we were supposed to buy a gift for my wife and my friend's fiance, and we both got in trouble. We got back to Jordan, we didn't have any money. We didn't have any gifts. So what my friend was doing in all these meetings said, but with great tact, he said, is it okay if I give the adhan? Bismillah. So he'd just go stand near the front. And he says, okay, he just asked, should I be leading? And I found that a bit strange. So I asked him. He said, no, because I know most of these guys, they don't know anything about the deen. Islamic publishers, of course, but except for one, rahmatullahi alayhi, he's son of one of the great scholars of Beirut, Shaykh Ramzi Dimashqiya. And he said, Sayyidi, please lead. But normally he did, but with discretion, right? So he just and that's where, sometimes you do the right thing, but you do it with tact. So what he did, he just said, could I give the adhan? So he'd go stand at the front, right? So he's already standing there. He just asked very naturally, should I lead? And and that's where good character is strength. We should have good character for the sake of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Right? But, and there, in those situations, you have to really guard one's heart, that we're doing this for the sake of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, and we should feel our neediness to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, so we don't fall into pride or arrogance or conceit or anything like that. You cannot pray fard behind someone praying a nafil in the Hanafi school. But again, there's difference of opinion with the other madhabs. Last thing that we're going to take is, and there's some details of who can pray behind whom, but one of the important things is that Salatul Jama'ah, congregational prayer, is based on congregation, on gathering. Right? So for a congregation to be valid, you need to be in the same place, actually or effectively. Actually, you're in the same place. You're in the same hall, for example. Right? In the same hall, in the same room. Effectively is that you're in an adjacent place. Right? Such that there isn't a big gap between you. So for example, if we're having the congregation here, you guys know the boardroom, right? That's considered adjacent. So if there are people praying in there, now it'd be better for if there's spillover, the spillover be to the immediately next place, which would be in the corridor, for example, right? But if there's a small gap, right, and the gap between here and the boardroom is not that big, so that would be okay as long as they're able to follow. Right? As long as they're able to follow, they can either hear or see the imam or the people behind, right? But, of course, now a masjid is all considered one place. So you can pray anywhere within the masjid as long as you're able to follow. But let's say, Seeker is not a masjid. Let's say the men are praying in the men's lobby over there, right? The men's lounge. And the sisters are praying in the boardroom. Are you in the same place? No, you're not in the same room. And are you adjacent? No. There's one place, two places away. So that congregation would not be valid, right? In that kind of situation, the ladies should just pray on their own, right? Now, in some situations, like for example, there's a masjid, there's a home right adjacent to the masjid, it would be valid to follow from there if it's right adjacent. Or there's a small gap, a small road. But if you're on the other side of the highway, that's a big gap, right? So there the congregation will not be valid. And the same thing applies. People are asking, what about a digital congregation, etc.? No, right? In that situation, it'd be better to pray at home, right? Like if there are people at home, they should pray together. Because the whole basis of jama'ah, and you also have to be careful, in that, just because an opinion exists, and there are opinions that you don't have to be exactly in the same place. But there's very dangerous implications. The application of law, right, is like, even if you think the legal system, you go for a small claims court, can they address, and is the judge qualified? Yeah, presumably. But can you take the big issues that affect all Canadians to the small claims court judge? No, because they don't have the legal expertise and experience. So things that have major implications, you can't just rely on. And we respect everyone, but that's not something that we even ask the local imam or something. Those things that affect everybody, and there's implications. Because if you could say that, well, everybody, you can do a jama'ah from home, then why would people need to go to Jummah prayer? Just think about all the implications. That's a very dangerous precedent. Like law, in any legal system, has precedents. So if you do that, then just imagine. Why would someone need to leave work? Just do Jummah from work. And that's why the ulama were very clear during the current pandemic that no, you can't do Jummah from home. Right? Because just think about the implications. If you can do Jummah home during this, a lot of people say, I have an excuse, I'm busy on Fridays. Right? In a lot of work settings, Fridays, you do end of the week review and this and that and the other people, and are most religious Muslims able to make it to Jummah if they put the effort into it? Yeah. Right? Yes. It's not a hardship. But so that's why fatwa is very delicate. Right? Fatwa is very delicate. So you need to be in the same place or adjacent to it, and that has implications sometimes if people are praying at home. So for example, if the men are in the basement, the ladies are on the ground floor, it's valid. But if there's no one praying on the ground floor, the men are in the basement, the ladies are on the first floor, your home is not a masjid, that's not a valid congregation. And some community centers and stuff, people aren't careful about that. Now there are fatwa and so on that are to the contrary, but practically, anything a Muslim does, especially that has, even in their own practice, but even more so that affects the worship or practice of others, it should be grounded in knowledge. Like there's a place here in our city that called itself masjid. It's not a masjid. It's not, because for something to be a masjid, it has to be endowed in perpetuity. So a place that's not owned initially cannot be called masjid. It's actually haram to refer to any place that's not endowed in perpetuity to be a masjid. Like a rental property cannot be masjid. Right? So like someone has a musalla in a public building, etc., even using the term this is masjid is haram. Even if you put a mihrab, a masjid is not that which has a mihrab or a mimbar, a masjid is. But secondly, these kinds of things, which just make it a habit. In your own practice, you're doing anything that has religious implications or implications related to Sharia. Al-ilm qabla al-amal, knowledge before action, in one's own life. You're starting a business, just as you find out about how to set it up and marketing and branding and this, and you do all these things, you also find out what are the limits of Allah regarding this and what is prophetic guidance regarding this. Right? These are the two questions. How do I do this validly? How do I do this properly? Right? How do I do this within the limits of Allah? How do I do this in a manner that's in accordance with the Sunnah? That should just be in anything that one does. You're going to start driving. There are limits of the deen related to that. Some of them are obvious, but just, okay, how do I do this in a manner pleasing to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala? Right? Now, you're setting up a musalla, for example. What are the rulings related to it? Consult. Find out. Right? And those are areas where that's where our community's effort should be going in terms of producing beneficial religious guidance and literature. A lot of times people just translate all kinds of random things, but practical guidance is what people need as individuals to live their religion in accordance with the limits of Allah and prophetic guidance, and likewise as a community. How should we set up musallas? How should masajid run in a manner, And very often people put a lot of effort in a lot of things, but basic things. So this quote unquote masjid, the men prayed in the ground floor, women prayed 2 floors above. And most of the women's area is ahead of even the imam. A good, I forget, 15 feet ahead. So according to the vast majority of Islamic scholars, the women are not in the same congregation. Right? For half a dozen reasons. Now, there are ways that it may be valid, whatever. So, you don't go and create fitna. But the underlying principle is that you don't risk your own worship, but don't risk the worship of others, right?
A lot of so-called conservative cultures, especially from back home, agree with or go with the fact that women shouldn't be allowed in the mosque, they should pay at home instead, but at the same time they spend hundreds of millions of dollars or having all these malls and entertainment places which is not Islamic, and they're making all these facilities for women, but when it comes to religion,
yeah. No, so our religion is one of balance, right? That at one level, yes, in itself, women, it's best for women to pray at home, etc. But at the same time, in a modern society, if someone is working, they're out. There's a really pious elderly South African Muslim leader, she was part of the apartheid movement, etc. He says, in South Africa we say that Allah made the entire earth a place of worship, except the mosque for Muslim women. Right? That as a Muslim you can pray anywhere on earth. That the whole earth is a masjid except the masjid for Muslim women. So I asked, Auntie, so what do you do if you're outside the house? She says, Beta, what we do, we go into the parking lot of the masjid and we pray in the parking lot. She says, and I feel so embarrassed because so you mentioned they open the door on one side and they have the driver or some ladies stand, like they create a just because you're praying and there's it said, and she's elderly, said, but I feel shy. Says, why can't, what harm will I cause if I go inside the masjid? Right? So that's not correct, right? Now, there are historical contexts too, and we have to appreciate that there's been a breakdown. You have to have rahmah with the ummah of the Prophet ﷺ, right? That the last several hundred years have been very difficult for the ummah, right? And with the breakdown of law and order in many Muslim societies and so on, certain things became much more conservative for certain reasons as well, right? That where it's unsafe, right, and there's chaos and no law and order, etc., would you want women to be walking to the masjid where they could be kidnapped, where they could be all kinds of things? So there's a context for certain rulings. We should have rahmah. When we don't understand something, we say, and that's part of having a good opinion. Doesn't mean we validate it, right? But we just say, I don't understand why this is the case. Number two, it doesn't necessarily apply in the circumstances we're in, right? Because we respect Islamic scholarship, we take for Islamic scholarship, but we are not in 19th century Cairo. Okay? Sayyidina Ali ibn Abi Talib said, don't teach your children the way your parents taught you, because your time is not their time. And that's between the time of the Prophet ﷺ and his time. Right? And he's not saying do things completely differently, because certain things change, certain contexts change. And that requires hikmah, wisdom. Right? We respect tradition, but tradition is not an ossified reality, right? It's not an ossified reality. It's a living reality, right? What may apply in a certain context might not necessarily apply in another. And I know Ustada Umar, once she went shopping with a cousin of mine, and Asr time in Karachi is very short. He says, we need to pray. He said, there's nowhere to pray. He says, there's nowhere in the marketplace to pray. I said, no. He said, what about the masjid? My cousin, I don't know any masjid in this area that. So my wife says, what would you do? So we just have to pray. So it would be Maghrib. Umar said, there's no way I'm going to let prayer miss. He said, then. So in the end, what they had to do, they weren't far from the Clifton Beach area, if any of you know Karachi. So they drove to the beach, and they prayed there's a pathway. They park the car such that again you have to so one and that's not but the ulama are cognizant of these things. In places like Pakistan, for example, all the senior ulama says that there needs to be a reasonable place for women in the masajid, etc. And those are, and there's many reasons. We have a number of answers on seekers related to that as well. There's many secondary reasons to go to the masjid as well. It's very important for the believer to be connected with community. Very often people don't have extended family and faithful neighborhoods and so on. So there's all kinds of religious reasons for encouraging women to have a connection with the masjid in terms of meeting, other believers, being in a religious environment to find a reminder, inspiration, all these different aspects. Any other questions before we close? Go ahead.
So, Shaykh, what's your opinion on the way we are saying Salah these days in masajid with the two?
No, so the separation, standing without gaps, is an emphasized sunnah, right? Right? It's an emphasized sunnah. So normally it's makruh to pray with a gap, unless there's an excuse. Unless there's an excuse. So even within a gap, within a row, for example, if there's a pillar, nobody has to like hug the pillar and pray, right? You can, and some masajid, the pillars are big. So if there's an excuse, there can be a gap in the row, right? Sometimes in historical masajid, there'd be other things in the middle. So there can be a gap if there's an excuse. And here there's a, there's a safety reason, so that's an excuse too.
Someone online is asking, is it no longer makruh tahrimi to do an act when believed to be most probably makruh tahrimi according to Allah in order to maintain unity?
Depends what the action is, but there's a difference. No, it's not unity. So it's conditioned, right? That something is, because there are things in our religion that are clear, and there's things in our religion that are not clear, right? And that's why there's ikhtilaf. And within difference of opinion, what we see the way of within the lifetime of the Prophet ﷺ, and also after a beautiful example of that is that once, during the Khilafah of Sayyidina Uthman, they're on a long journey. They're on a journey. From morning time, Sayyidina Uthman, who was the Khalifa, and Sayyidina Abdullah ibn Mas'ud, who's known as the most learned of the companions after the Khulafa, they were arguing, or they're discussing, or debating about whether you can pray in full when you're a traveler. Like the 4 rak'ah prayers, you have the choice to pray them in full. Abdullah ibn Mas'ud was swearing that I have traveled in the journeys of the Prophet ﷺ. He always shortened. Sayyidina Uthman disagreed. He said, no, prayer is good. If you wish to shorten, shorten. If you wish to pray in full, pray in full. And they were debating all the time till the prayer time came. And Sayyidina Uthman was the Amir al-Mu'mineen. He was going to lead. He's going to pray 4 rak'ahs. Who's praying right behind him? And there are travelers. The person standing right behind him was Abdullah ibn Mas'ud. So one of the other people said, تُنْكِرُ عَلَيْهِ ثُمَّ تُصَلِّ خَلْفَهُ, that you would condemn what he says, but then pray behind him. And he says, الْخِلَافُ شَرٌ, that differing is evil. And there's a difference between difference of opinion and differing, meaning diverging, that we're disunited. Why? Because in matters of difference of opinion, we have to understand that there's things that al-halalu bayyin wal-haramu bayyin. There's things that are clearly established to be allowed and clearly not allowed. And that's what is agreed upon in our deen. And then there are matters where there's disagreement. In that we follow what is right, but with wisdom. With wisdom. Right? And that's been, it is said that Imam al-Shafi'i, it is said that he prayed in the masjid next to where Imam Abu Hanifa was buried, and he didn't do qunut in Fajr. And they were surprised because in the Shafi'i school, the qunut of Fajr is one of the central sunnahs. And they asked him, you didn't do this? This is one of the important sunnahs. The Shafi'is distinguish between the regular sunnahs and what they call the ab'ab, the key sunnahs. And one of them is the qunut of Fajr. He says, out of respect for the one buried over there, meaning Imam Abu Hanifa. Okay? And there's a balance in our religion. In Damascus, where it's like half Hanafi and Shafi'i, frequently the Shafi'i scholars would sometimes not raise their hands, or sometimes they would just do the qunut quietly. Why? So people appreciate that this is not deen, that I'm Shafi'i, therefore my deen is I give qunut. sometimes the Hanafis would pause, and although Hanafis are more reluctant to do this because Hanafis tend to be a little more hard-headed, but there are of the Hanafis who once in a while give the qunut. Why? Just to make people appreciate that these are matters of difference. It's not like do whatever you feel like, with principle, with wisdom, with understanding, because to keep people together is a very important consideration. So all the ulama have asked that, what if women are together and the majority are going to be praying in congregation, the women's only congregation? Said the asl will be you pray with them. Because yes, in the Hanafi school is makruh tahriman, but that's not the deen. That's one interpretation, right? And we, so that's not an unconditioned thing. But if someone's doing something wrong, we don't follow them in something that's wrong. Any questions? Go ahead.
So if a person is praying sitting down on the ground,
Yeah.
and then in prostration, they're just able to go to this extent because they're dizzy, is that considered head?
Yeah, that's head movements. Yeah. So if someone had head movements or other conditions, they have, something, then it's against the sunnah to bow deeply. Right? And that's part of that Allah loves for His dispensations to be taken, just as He loves for the strict opinions to be taken. Right? So there, like some people, they'll bow. The Prophet ﷺ saw someone pray with head movements with a pillow in front of them so they could put their head on the pillow. He told them not to do that. Why? Because Allah has made it easy. And so we embrace that. Right? We embrace that just bend slightly, and that's enough. I mean, of course, if you do it slightly more, but you don't have to exert that extra effort, because that's rahmah, right? And sometimes it's good, like just in our own circles, when someone has that kind of situation, to show them that how easy, to show them the ease, because already like someone's sick, they're in hospital. One of the shuyukh, he's Shafi'i. I just want to tell the Shafi'i, so just, because whenever things are difficult, you have to follow the Hanafi school. Why don't you just make things easy for yourself? Just follow the Hanafi school to start off with. He's a learned Shafi'i scholar. He said, in your madhab, when you do tayammum, when you're, this, what is it? But he is in hospital, he's got an IV, etc. He has to make tayammum, right? So I had to explain Hanafi fiqh of tayammum quickly to him. He wanted to make sure, he kind of knew it. But in those situations, it's already difficult enough. So it's good to show people one, the ease that they have available, but also to console them, because a lot of times, people feel bad that I can't do the whole thing. Right? It's really important to remind people of the rahmah of Allah, the rahmah of prophetic teachings as well, and that you're not missing out. Because it's going to be tough. Remember when I was like my eye trouble, like literally, like I just pray the fard in congregation, and I'm there, and I'm sitting in my office because I couldn't pray tarawih in congregation because of my eye stuff, and it's heavy. You feel bad, so but you have to remind yourself, right? And sometimes it's good just to talk things through with somebody about that, right? I actually talked to one of my teachers, and you know this. I said, but just tell me anyways. Right? Because فَذَكِّرْ فَإِنَّ ذِكْرَ تَنْفَعُ الْمُؤْمِنِينَ. Okay? Sometimes you even know it, but it just helps to have that reminder, right? And sometimes you should just know, I'm weak. I need a reminder. Because you tell yourself, maybe you're being a slacker or this, and you can, so just, it's good to know that one is weak. So we'll stop here. There is the Quran class. Do take advantage of that. Shaykh Yusuf and Salah Halima are available for that, and it's a very simple thing. Even if it just takes a few minutes, but it makes a big difference. بإذن الله تعالى وصلى الله على سيدنا محمد وعلى آله وصحبه وسلم.